May 5, 1945. Wageningen, Western Netherlands. The war was almost over, but for the people who stepped out of their homes that morning, victory didn't look like celebration. It looked like survival. Staff Sergeant William Cooper of the 101st Airborne sat in the back of a jeep as it rolled slowly through the narrow Dutch streets. The wind carried no cheers, no songs, only the faint scrape of wooden clogs on cobblestones. The houses looked empty, like their walls had forgotten the sound of life. Cooper had seen liberated towns before: France, Belgium, Luxembourg. There were always flags, laughter, wine. Here, there was silence. Then he saw them. Figures stepping cautiously from doorways, thin, hollow-eyed, wrapped in layers of torn fabric, not soldiers, not prisoners, civilians. And the children. They didn't run. They shuffled. Their faces were pale, their cheeks sunken, their limbs like fragile sticks. A girl stood by the road, no older than 7, in a faded dress that hung from her like a ghost of clothing. Her eyes were enormous, too big for her face. And when the jeep stopped, she didn't move. She only watched. Cooper reached into his field pack. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but something else. He pulled out a single D-ration chocolate bar, the kind soldiers ate when nothing else was left. He knelt, the metal of his boot scraping the dirt, and held it out. For a moment, nothing happened. The child stared at it, unsure if it was real. Then her fingers darted forward, fast, desperate, and she clutched the chocolate to her chest as if it were life itself. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. Thank you. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief. Behind her, more children appeared, dozens, maybe more. Small bodies, quiet eyes. They didn't beg. They just looked. Break out everything we've got, Cooper said quietly. His men hesitated. Rations were low and orders were clear, but orders didn't matter anymore. Crates were opened, cans handed out, pieces of bread broken apart by hands that had carried rifles only hours before. The air filled with the sound of unwrapping, of trembling hands holding food again for the first time in months. One soldier started crying. Another knelt beside a boy too weak to stand and fed him spoon by spoon. There were no photographers, no speeches, just exhausted men feeding starving children on the last day of a long war. In that moment, the lines between victor and victim blurred into something simpler: human beings, remembering what mercy looked like. The Dutch called it de Hongerwinter, the hunger winter, a season when food became memory and survival became prayer. And now, as American soldiers handed out chocolate and canned meat in the ruins of spring, they were witnessing what starvation had done to an entire generation. For the children of the Netherlands, liberation didn't arrive with gunfire. It arrived wrapped in brown paper, sweet, melting, and almost unbelievable. The hunger winter didn't come with bombs or fire. It came quietly. On the wind, through empty train stations and silent warehouses. In September 1944, after years of occupation, the Netherlands had finally begun to hope. Allied forces were pushing east. The failed offensive known as Operation Market Garden had nearly liberated the country. The Dutch government in exile called for a national railway strike to cripple the German retreat. A desperate act of defiance meant to speed victory. The Germans answered with starvation. Food shipments to the western provinces, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht, were cut off. Bridges were destroyed, canals frozen, roads blocked by military patrols. The most populated part of the Netherlands became a prison of 4 million people, with no supply lines and no mercy. At first, the change was subtle. Rations shrank, bread disappeared, potatoes were traded like gold. Then came the real winter. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks. The canals turned to glass. The last trains stopped running, their tracks buried in snow. And in the silence, a new enemy settled in: hunger. Families burned their furniture for heat: doors, chairs, anything that could feed a fire. Gardens were stripped bare. People boiled tulip bulbs for soup, ate sugar beets meant for livestock, or scraped the flour dust from empty sacks to bake bread that tasted like dirt. In Amsterdam, teachers fainted in classrooms, police officers collapsed on patrol, doctors recorded children weighing less than 20 pounds. By February 1945, the average adult was surviving on 400 calories a day, less than a single chocolate bar. 18,000 people would die before the spring thaw, most of them children and the elderly. The Dutch called it simply de honger, the hunger. But hunger was too small a word. It wasn't just the absence of food, it was the erosion of everything human. Parents stopped speaking to conserve energy. Children stopped playing because laughter took strength they didn't have. Journal entries from those months read like messages from another world. Today, we boiled wallpaper to scrape the glue. It has a little taste of flour. My son asks for bread every night. I tell him tomorrow. I have told him tomorrow for 2 months. The hunger winter was no accident. It was punishment, a deliberate act of cruelty ordered by a collapsing empire. German occupation authorities knew the people were starving. They ignored every plea for relief. Neutral nations tried to send supplies. Trains were turned back. Barges were sunk. Inside the country, black markets appeared, dangerous, desperate exchanges where a wedding ring could buy a loaf of bread. People walked for days through snow-covered countryside in what became known as the hunger journeys, trading furniture or clothes for food from rural farmers. Some never came back. The ones who did told stories of frozen rivers lined with bodies, people who had fallen asleep in the cold and never woken up. And yet, even as the land froze, the Dutch resistance kept moving. Secret radios still broadcast. Hidden presses still printed underground newspapers. Hope became the only ration no one could take away. By April 1945, the Allied armies were closing in from the east. The Germans were retreating. But for millions trapped behind their lines, salvation still meant another week, another night, without food. The world had stopped fighting. But in the Netherlands, the war was still eating people alive. April 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but in the Netherlands, death still ruled the streets. The Germans were collapsing on every front. Allied bombers thundered overhead on their way to the east. The snow was melting, turning the canals into black mirrors of ice and water. And in those reflections, Dutch civilians could now see something new: planes flying low, not with bombs, but with food. For the first time in months, people ran into the open instead of hiding. The sound was the same as always: roaring engines, the whistle of air pressure over rooftops. But this time, it meant life. On April 29, 1945, Operation Manna began. British bombers, the same Lancaster aircraft that had once reduced German cities to rubble, now flew at treetop height over starving towns. Their bomb bays opened, and instead of death, they dropped sacks of flour, canned meat, sugar, milk powder. Each drop zone was carefully marked: white sheets, red crosses, and huge painted letters spelling "Thanks, boys" across open fields. People cried when they saw it. They didn't even wait for the planes to leave. Children were running into the fields before the last parachutes touched the ground, their bare feet sinking into mud, searching for anything to eat. For 8 days the bombers came. 6,680 tons of food falling from the sky. And then the Americans joined in. Their version was called Operation Chowhound. B-17 Flying Fortresses, the same aircraft that had once rained destruction on Berlin, now descended low and slow over The Hague and Rotterdam, the crews waving to starving families who waved back with flags and rags. In one of those planes, a waist gunner named Private Eugene Henderson wrote in his logbook, "We flew over The Hague today." You could see them, tiny figures below, waving their hands. I never thought I'd see people cry over bread falling from the sky. On the ground, chaos and grace mixed together. There were no official distributions at first. Hungry crowds stormed the drop zones, breaking open crates, dividing cans, fighting and embracing all at once. Soldiers from the Dutch resistance tried to keep order. Mothers hid food under their clothes. Children ate sugar by the handful, their faces streaked with tears. The Germans, desperate and defeated, did not interfere. Some even helped guide the supplies. A few Wehrmacht officers stood silently at the edges of the fields, watching civilians swarm around Allied rations, perhaps understanding for the first time what mercy looked like. But the truth was harsher. The airdrops alone couldn't save everyone. Thousands were too weak to eat solid food. Doctors begged for milk, for medicine, for vitamins, things that couldn't fall from the sky. In hospitals, children still died clutching pieces of bread they were too weak to swallow. The Allies knew it. The pilots knew it. Every man in those bombers understood that what they were doing wasn't enough, but it was something. It was hope made visible. One RAF commander later said, "We drop food like we once dropped bombs, with precision, with purpose. Only this time, it felt like redemption." For the Dutch people, it was more than relief. It was proof that the world hadn't forgotten them. And as the planes roared past one last time, sunlight breaking through spring clouds, they left behind not just food, but faith that maybe, just maybe, the war's end would come before the next child starved to death. In the first days of May 1945, the war was almost over, but in the Netherlands, no one was celebrating. Not yet. On the morning of May 2nd, German troops still occupied much of the western provinces. The Allied front had stopped just beyond the rivers. The Dutch civilians, millions of them starving, were trapped between two armies waiting for a surrender that hadn't come. And then something unthinkable happened. The Germans asked for a truce, not for themselves, for the Dutch. In a meeting near Wageningen, German and Allied officers sat at the same table for the first time in years. Between them lay maps of starving cities and photos of children too weak to stand. Both sides knew the war was lost. Both sides knew people were dying every hour. The British negotiator, General Folks, spoke first. "We can end this," he said, "but we'll need your word. No firing on our planes, no interference with our supply lines." The German general nodded. He was pale, exhausted. His uniform hung loose on him, like it belonged to another man. "You have my word," he said quietly. "The people are hungry. Even my men are hungry." For the first time since the invasion, enemies agreed on something that wasn't destruction. The result was a fragile ceasefire, an invisible border, across which mercy was allowed to pass. Allied trucks loaded with food and medicine began rolling through German checkpoints under white flags. The convoys were called Operation Faust. Eyewitnesses remembered it like a miracle. British trucks painted with red crosses crawling through Dutch villages, greeted by silent crowds. German soldiers standing guard, not with rifles raised, but with hands lowered. Some even helped unload the trucks. An American war correspondent wrote, "I watched a British sergeant hand a can of milk to a German private. Neither said a word. Both looked like they hadn't slept in days. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. Compassion between enemies." The roads into The Hague, Rotterdam, and Utrecht filled with people too weak to cheer. Mothers carried children who could barely lift their heads. Old men stumbled forward, whispering prayers they hadn't dared speak in months. When the first trucks reached Amsterdam, the city erupted, not in noise, but in tears. Civilians lined the streets, watching as soldiers passed out bread, biscuits, and tins of stew. Some kissed the trucks. Others knelt in the mud, clutching food like relics. For many, it was the first real meal in half a year. Doctors begged people to eat slowly, to let their bodies adjust. But hunger had no patience. A few ate too fast and died within hours, their hearts too weak to handle mercy. Still, even with tragedy, the moment felt holy. For the first time since 1940, the Dutch people saw Germans lower their weapons. And for the first time since the war began, mercy moved faster than hate. Later, one Allied medic wrote in his diary, "It wasn't victory we saw that day. It was something far greater, forgiveness." And in that fragile silence, while both armies stood still and trucks rolled through the wreckage of Europe, the war that had consumed the world finally began to starve itself. By the second week of May 1945, the guns in Europe were silent, but for millions in the Netherlands, the battle wasn't over. It had moved inside their bodies. The war had ended with a whisper instead of a roar. On May 5th, the German forces in the Netherlands surrendered. The news spread through Amsterdam like a shock wave. No cheering, no flags yet, just people standing in the streets, crying quietly. Liberation had come, but so had the reckoning. The first Allied medical teams to enter the Western cities found something beyond numbers or statistics. Hospitals that had no fuel for months, wards lit by candles, rows of children lying in beds made from doors and blankets. Doctors spoke in whispers. They had no more tears left. The average body weight of an adult man in Amsterdam was just 45 kilograms. For children, as low as 20. The human machine had been pushed beyond its limits. Allied forces turned from soldiers into caretakers. Field kitchens replaced artillery. Tents became clinics. Every truck that once carried ammunition now carried flour, milk, penicillin. One British officer wrote, "We fought for 5 years to end this war, and now we fight again, this time to keep these people alive." In the first days, some died from the very thing they had prayed for: food. Their bodies, too weak to digest fat or sugar, collapsed under the shock of abundance. Dutch doctors called it the hunger syndrome. The Allies called it the price of mercy. But even as graves were filled, life was returning. Within weeks, school bells rang again. Churches opened. Shops unlocked doors that had been barred for 5 years. Children played in streets where bodies had once fallen. And the Allied soldiers, those hard, tired men who had marched through hell, stayed. They played football with Dutch kids. They shared their rations, their songs, their stories. One American wrote home, "I never thought feeding a child could feel like winning a battle." In the Dutch villages, children followed them everywhere, laughing for the first time in months. They called the soldiers the men from the sky. Not everyone was saved. Some families never recovered. Too many buried before help arrived. But for those who did, the taste of that first meal was something they never forgot. Years later, when asked about liberation, one woman said, "It didn't begin with flags or guns. It began with bread." In the ashes of war, kindness had become a weapon stronger than any bomb. The Allied crews who had once dropped fire from the sky now dropped life. And the Dutch people, who had been reduced to shadows, found themselves again in the faces of strangers who refused to let them die. The hunger winter was over, but the memory of it, of the quiet, of the empty streets, of the first taste of bread, would never fade. In the weeks after liberation, the Netherlands began to breathe again. It was a slow breath, weak, trembling, but real. The streets that had echoed with boots and gunfire were now filled with the sound of wagons and laughter. Children who had once walked like ghosts were now chasing each other through the same ruins that had nearly buried them. Bread was back. Milk returned. Smoke rose from chimneys again, not from burning furniture, but from warm kitchens. And everywhere, Allied soldiers stood among them, tall, weary, still in uniform, but no longer at war. They were building something gentler. In Amsterdam, American field kitchens became neighborhood centers. Mothers came with metal cups and spoons, children with tin cans tied to strings. The smell of soup drifted through shattered windows and open courtyards. It wasn't just food. It was forgiveness in steam. One RAF pilot who had flown in Operation Manna visited the city weeks later. He walked through a street where people recognized the insignia on his jacket. A woman ran up and pressed something into his hand, a small handmade pin shaped like a loaf of bread. She said, "You fed my children." He didn't know what to say. He just nodded, eyes full. Across the country, resistance fighters came out of hiding. Collaborators were arrested. Flags appeared in every window, orange, white, and blue, fluttering in spring wind. But even in the joy, there was a quiet understanding. This freedom had been paid for not just with bullets, but with hunger, loss, and mercy. The soldiers left one by one. The bombers that once dropped food flew home empty, their bellies no longer needed. But in their absence, they left something behind: stories. In schools, teachers told children about the plains of bread. In markets, people spoke softly about the Germans who hadn't fired on the convoys. In churches, the pastor said the war had ended because men chose compassion over pride. The hunger winter became memory, but it was a memory that carried weight, a warning and a promise. A promise that even in the darkest corners of war, there are choices that matter more than victory. And for those who had survived, those who had tasted the first piece of Allied bread and felt life return through salt and sugar, the memory of that moment stayed like a scar you could live with. Because survival isn't about strength, it's about kindness that refuses to die. And in that spring of 1945, as tulips pushed through broken streets and the children of the Netherlands began to smile again, the world realized something simple and eternal. Sometimes, mercy lasts longer than victory. When the last truck disappeared behind the corner, silence returned. Not the silence of fear, but of peace. the kind that feels strange, almost unreal. The war had ended weeks ago, but for many, this moment was the true end. A can of soup in a child's hand meant more than any treaty or victory parade. It meant that mercy had survived. For months, the skies that once rained bombs now rained bread. And people looked up, not in terror,